Any further ado, we'll get on with our talk. Welcome everyone. So for those of you who don't know Michael and are part of the data science group, you've got a lot to thank Michael for, because he was, in his days when he was with Monash, he really got behind the group, and they've been a kind of sponsor of the group ever since. And it was Michael who kind of initiated that. And I'm really looking forward to this talk today. As I was saying to Michael earlier, I don't know whether to be worried or more worried about the content, but we'll soon find out. So I'll hand you over to Michael. So welcome, Michael, and looking forward to a great presentation.
Thanks, Phil. Hi, I'm Michael Brand, and thanks for joining this talk about Facebook and election influence. Bit of background. So as some of you will have already heard, I have been a data scientist for about 25 years now, probably a bit more. And 2 years ago, I started a data science consultancy called Otzma Analytics that deals with strategic data science, which is the kind of data science that makes a qualitative change. And the subject matter of this talk certainly qualifies. And I do meta research, which means that I analyze other people's analyses. And usually that's in order to stress test them. Some of you have heard me do that in other talks of mine. In this particular talk, I'm not going to stress test any research. What I'm going to do is I'm going to connect the dots between many different researchers. What I never do is politics. And this talk, if you were expecting to hear political opinions, you're going to be disappointed. This talk is just going to be about research and data, and I'm going to try to present the facts as evenly as I can. If you were going to post your political opinions on the chat or in Q&A, I've asked Phil to be very vigilant about not allowing that. So please don't. So first question is, why am I picking on Facebook? Why am I singling Facebook out? Why not speak about social media in general? This is a question I was asked recently in an ABC News interview, and I think it's a wonderful question. So let me start on that. It's because they're the biggest bully in the yard. They are the #1 consumer of our online time investment, 1/8 of our total time, completely off the charts from anything else. They have over 1/3 of the planet's population as their monthly active users. That's just an outlandish number. These are people who do not have running water that have Facebook. Contrary to popular opinion, people do read their news on Facebook. 43% of Americans read their news on Facebook. That is more than twice the nearest competitor. They've got incredibly deep pockets. We'll talk more about that later on, but in the last 4 quarters, they had over $75 billion of revenue. That number keeps going up. 2/3 of that goes back to operating costs. And I just want to point out, when that's your operating costs, over $50 billion, this pays for a whole lot of data scientists and social psychologists and behavioral economists and persuasion technologists and addiction specialists and engineers and artists and the 50,000 plus other employees of Facebook. And you'll still have left to pay for a few billionaires. So on top of that, they also have a very, very bad and draconian terms of service that allows them to do pretty much everything they want. It's a 200-page document that you guys did not read. And just to summarize, this is not my summarization, this is legal scholars having looked at it. Facebook can use any of your stuff for any reason they want without paying you for advertising in particular. And the rating that site TOSDR gives Facebook's terms of service is a class E. They have a rating A through E. E is the worst. E means the terms of service raise very serious concerns. And as you can see, there are a whole lot of no-goes on this class E. There are a whole lot of no-nos and not a single thumbs up on anything that they do. And if you think that, oh, well, that's just the industry, everybody does that, the answer is no. So obviously you were expecting probably DuckDuckGo to be a class A and Wikipedia class B. Shouldn't surprise anyone. But Google and Amazon are both class C, and Facebook's most direct competitors, YouTube and Twitter, are both class D. Facebook is certainly a standout with just how bad their terms of service are. Next up, they have a really, really bad history with ethics. People sometimes ask me, when did this start? When did Facebook start with these ethical problems that they seem to have every 5 minutes? And the answer is in the first 5 minutes. This is an IM exchange between Mark Zuckerberg and a college friend months after Facebook was launched. I'm not going to read it out to you. I've self-censored it here because I don't like profanities, but you get the picture. Next up, it is an immersive environment that is geared to sell. And I'm going to quote Jeff Hammerbacher here, who was one of the co-founders of Facebook. The best minds of my generation are thinking about how to make people click ads. That sucks. And I'm sure when he said that, what he meant was that these people could be curing cancer. But I think equally bad is the fact that when you have the best minds of a generation thinking about how to persuade people, then you're going to end up with a super weapon for persuasion. And that's exactly what they did. They built a laboratory that gives not just ideal laboratory conditions, but also maximum influenceability. And you can look at all of the various aspects of what you would want from such an ideal environment, and you can tick mark Facebook all along the line. Let's begin with some common misconceptions, because when I tell people about Facebook, they usually start off by thinking, well, that doesn't apply to me. Well, it does really, because if you think only stupid people can be influenced like that, well, no. These are universal cognitive biases. You can read up on them, and everybody is influenced by them. And if you think that if you know they're doing it to you, you can ignore it, no. They're pre-attentive reactions. They're uncontrollable. I recommend watching The Social Dilemma on Netflix, where you will be able to see lots of the people who design these systems say that they themselves can't escape their influence. The other kind of objection that I sometimes hear is people telling me that they've looked at Facebook, they know what Facebook is, and it's not all of the things I describe it to be. And that's because you're looking at your own feed, but your own feed is 100% personalized, and it's completely unlike what anybody else sees. So you cannot in any way make extrapolations based on it. So with those things in place, let's talk about the basic data science of Facebook influence. And we're going to start with the things that you do in data science everywhere. So that's not going to surprise you. The first thing that you do is you gather data. As an example, Trump's 2016 campaign built a database that they called Project Alamo, and it contained detailed identity profiles on pretty much every voter in America. They purchased data from certified Facebook marketing partners, that's Experian and Datalogix and Epsilon and Axiom. So they had finance data, purchase data, demographics, age, religion, you name it. And also they had Cambridge Analytica psychographic data. By the way, if you think that Cambridge Analytica is any less ethical than the rest, no, they're all equally unethical. And if you are wondering whether Cambridge Analytica is any less legal than the rest, nope, they're equally all legal. I don't have time in 1 hour to go into the Cambridge Analytica scandal, but it's very interesting stuff. On top of all of these things, they used lookalike hyper-targeting, which Facebook just provides out of the box, and they use that to bootstrap the campaign. And altogether, these are tens of thousands of attributes per person in America, so per voter in America. The Cambridge Analytica data alone is about 5,000 attributes. Axiom is another 11,000, and so forth. Next thing that you want is to use that data in order to segment or map your population in meaningful ways. And in 2013, Kosinski et al., so Michal Kosinski et al., published this paper called Private Traits and Attributes Are Predictable from Digital Records of Human Behavior. Digital records of human behavior is code name for Facebook likes. They just used likes, and they used a handful of likes at that. They had something like an average of 50 likes per person that they looked at. And what they were able to do with those likes was to predict with amazing areas under the curve and amazing correlation coefficients, sexual orientation, ethnicity, religious and political views, personality traits, intelligence, happiness, use of addictive substances, parental separation, age, gender, you name it. And this is just from a handful of likes. This is just from likes that almost invariably had nothing to do with any of the things that were being predicted. And that's only a fraction of the data that I mentioned before that was used in political campaigns. And that is, in turn, only a very, very small fraction of the gigabytes over gigabytes of data that Mark Zuckerberg has over each and every user. Now, you might think that in order to get these excellent AUCs and coefficients, they had to use some incredibly sophisticated AI. They did not. What they did was they just took the likes, put them in SVD in order to reduce the dimensionality to 100, and then use logistic regression and linear regression as may be the case. That's it. That's probably the simplest model you're ever going to see in production, and that's what it does. And they still have an online version of it in case you want to check how well it does for you. Okay, so you did that, and now you can start experimenting because you want to look at how various demographics are impacted by various stimuli so that you'll know how to optimize them. And when we think about data science, we generally think about marketing. So all the people who want to sell you shampoos and whatnot. But in fact, data science for political purposes came first. In 1959, the Simulmatics Corporation was already doing political data science. This is a year before Peter Noer ever coined the phrase data science to begin with. And even back then, it was considered a threat to democracy. Let's talk about some of the experiments that Facebook has been doing. So in 2010, they had an experiment, which is what really got me interested in this subject, called the voter megaphone. They had this little button. This is what it looked like, that said about all of these people in the picture that they voted and encouraged you to click if you voted. And by the way, just being able to use your picture in this way is one of the many no-goes that the Facebook Terms of Service has. So they did that, and they learned that they can impact voter turnout just by having this button, and how much they impacted it depended very much on the details of the button, specifically on which pictures they were showing, which of your friends, because some friends are more persuasive than others. And they did that on 61 million users and managed to boost voting by 340,000 votes, way more than enough to determine a president in the US. And they've been using it in every election ever since in the US and in many other places besides. 2 years later, a different political experiment, they changed the amount of political content in news feeds. They've done that for 1.9 million users. And what they showed is that it wasn't just online behavior that is being impacted by the news feed. It's also offline behavior. Voting percentages actually rose by full percents very dramatically. Again, more than enough to determine an election in the US. So those were experiments about how to optimize stimuli. Here's where it gets more interesting, because in social media, you don't just blindly try to influence everyone. You very judiciously target the influencers, and you want them to influence everybody else. And the first to do that in earnest was Obama's 2008 campaign. And they thought of it as a cost-saving device. You know, you touch thousands, you move millions. But what actually happened was that it gave that campaign a feeling of a grassroots movement. And that was so successful that everybody's been copying it ever since. And the moral of the story is there's no such thing as grassroots. Whenever you see anybody, you know, the people are rising up, no, the people have their strings pulled. This is how that just works, and this is how it looks these days. And as an example of a Facebook experiment to show that, in 2014, they had an experiment that they themselves called the emotion contagion experiment. Almost 700,000 users were given feed that was manipulated on how much or how little happy news and how little sad news you got. And they showed that not only did that impact people's emotional states, it impacted the emotional states of their friends. So that is emotional contagion, which they could follow down the graph. By the way, this wasn't a surprise to anyone, because if you remember the 2010 voter megaphone experiment, I said that 340,000 votes were boosted. That is completely true, but only 60,000 of those were by people who actually saw the button. All of the rest was network influence. So on the face of it, Facebook didn't think there was anything very problematic about this experiment. They even published it in PNAS. They saw it as having a clear business purpose. They wanted happy users. And Facebook does want happy users, not too happy, because then they'll go offline and live their life, but just happy enough to keep them clicking. But that didn't fool anyone, and ethicists were furious by the lack of oversight on this, the lack of any form of ethical review, no opt-outs, and all of those. And the larger public was furious about the emotional manipulation. But one reaction I want to single out in particular, this was Clay Johnson, who said at the time, "The Facebook transmission of anger experiment is terrifying. Could Mark Zuckerberg swing an election by promoting Upworthy posts 2 weeks beforehand? Should that be legal? Could the CIA incite revolution in Sudan by pressuring Facebook to promote discontent? Should that be legal?" So what I'm trying to say here, the writing was on the wall. Clay Johnson said that in 2014. I was speaking about it in, from 2012 on or so. And by 2015, I already had it as part of my teaching material at Monash. 2016, I was already publishing about this sort of thing. This was pretty obvious to everyone who was looking at it that this was going to be weaponized. The reason why Clay Johnson in particular is interesting is because he was a co-founder for the firm who managed Obama's 2008 campaign. So he was probably the best situated person to make use of this. And instead of saying, "Oh, look, I've got a shiny new tool that I can make use of," his reaction was, "This is going to be weaponized." And indeed it was immediately after. So let's talk about that. Deception. So short history of deception. Propaganda has been around for centuries. The Vatican had an office of propaganda from the 14th century. The Russians are usually the ones credited for bringing it to the modern era, and this is part of their active measures. Disinformation is only part of that. At around 2000, they started what they called web brigades. They employed users in order to post propaganda as comments on websites. And at around 2012, they looked at what Facebook has been doing with all of these experiments, every tool that Facebook has developed and approved, and they said, we can do some computational propaganda. And by 2013, they started the Internet Research Agency, the IRA, which is the troll farm that has been running bot campaigns ever since. And how has the IRA been used in election meddling? Well, according to a 2017 analysis, specifically when it comes to election, you can do many things. You can intimidate voters or bribe them or disinform them. You can hack elections, or if you can't hack them, you can create the impression that they've been compromised, which is almost as good. Of course, that was in 2017 and has nothing to do with anything that's going on in 2020. But that's just the hows of it. Election meddling is also interesting in terms of the whys of it, because you can have many different aims when you're meddling in elections. You can boost the turnout for your desired candidate. You can suppress other votes. You can split other votes. You can change voters' preferences, or you can sow general confusion and distrust in the elections. And perhaps the entire key for everything that comes after this is the insight that suppressing and splitting is easy, changing voters' preferences is hard. So whereas classically, when you're talking about how politicians used to behave, you would expect, as a citizen, you were expecting politicians to be largely truthful. I'm not going to put too fine a point on that, largely truthful, and try to persuade you to vote for them. And that is simply going down the hardest path. And politicians have simply started being data-driven ever since. And in recent years, they've been doing the much easier and more cost-effective things in order to win elections. And that is to lie to you and suppress the vote of the people that they don't want to vote for them, which is much, much easier to do. Now, examples of non-politicians, but rather IRA doing that, is splitting the Democratic vote when the Democratic primaries were running. Remember, they had a great many candidates, and they boosted Bernie Sanders just in order to get votes away from the likes of Joe Biden. And another example, they've suppressed selected votes. How? Through Facebook, by having a disinformation campaign that convinced selected populations that they can vote by sending an SMS message. So obviously everyone who was convinced by that and simply sent the SMS text message and said, well, here I voted, didn't have their vote counted, and that's one vote better for this election. And this is the IRA. To give a political example, the Trump campaign used $150 million just in the last few weeks before the 2016 election to almost entirely negative ads targeted at suppressing 3.5 million people, reportedly. Okay, so there are a whole lot of moving parts here in terms of the hows and the whys of election meddling and deception at large, and I thought it would be good to use a theoretical model that simplifies all of this a great deal. This is the Borden-Kopp model. It was developed in 1999, and again, this was based on what the Russians were already doing at the time, and it shows 5 ways, really 4 ways and 2 variants. The degradation has 2 variants here of how to perform deception. And the idea is, this is an information theoretical model, and it shows how deception in its various ways impacts your ability to determine the true message. So you can hide the message in noise, that's degradation. You can mimic a real message, that's like fake news, that's called corruption. You can just get a person to not ever see the message, that's denial. And you can subvert processing. That is, you can convince a person not to believe the message even if they see it. That's called subversion. And basically, any tool that you can use to deceive, you can use in one of these 4 different ways. And disinformation campaigns generally have a multiple of them. They work on multiple of these dimensions. So for example, let's look at hyper-targeting. How can I leverage hyper-targeting if I want to deceive using it? Well, what is hyper-targeting? Hyper-targeting means that what I'm seeing is not what other people are seeing. So if another person is getting different facts from Facebook than I get, and because of that they make choices, those choices will seem completely unreasonable to me, because I would never make those choices based on the facts that I have. And that makes me not say, oh, they must be working on a different set of facts. We're not wired to say that. What we are wired is to say, well, I don't trust that person. Their judgment doesn't seem sound to me. And once you have that tool, you can very easily break down true communications, and that's corruption. You can build distrust between populations, and that's subversion. So, you know, once another person speaks to you, you just won't believe them if their message doesn't conform with what the deception campaign is about. You can promise different things to different people, and you can scare different populations about different things. And that's denial, because I don't know what you said to those other people. I don't know what you promised to them. I don't know how you scared them. And this is not just true, by the way, for the individual users. In Facebook, this is also a problem from the regulator side. There have been calls that some of Trump's 2016 negative ads did not comply with federal law, and there's just no way to check those claims, because Facebook refuses to say which ads were run, how many ads were run, who saw which ad. We don't know. We do know that ultimately those ads sent people to 100,000 plus different websites with different creative content. Finally, you can just confuse the issue. You can introduce irrelevancies by spamming people's feeds with all sorts of noise. Or alternatively, you can get everyone interested in one irrelevancy, and that's the kind of one-day rage campaigns that you get to see quite a lot recently with things like cancel culture. And that's degradation. So all 5 just by looking at hyper-targeting. Now, obviously, that's not the only thing that you can do when you have this extreme ability to personalize. And most famous is the fact that personalization can create echo chambers through filter bubbles. Now, you will have heard these terms, but I still want to go through what they actually mean, because I find that people interpret them in very different ways. So if there is an opinion spectrum, it has some distribution. But if you are watching that through a filter bubble, through the algorithm only picking certain things to appear in your newsfeed and not others, you will be getting a very different apparent distribution, and it will be a much narrower distribution than the actual distribution. And that's the idea of an echo chamber. They are personalized. Now, originally, obviously, this was started because Facebook wanted to give you the news you're interested in. But the reason why the algorithms favor this is because of confirmation bias. Because when we hear the things that we a priori agree with, we tend to be happier. That's one of our cognitive biases. And that's one of those things that keeps us clicking. So very good for the original purpose. But once we are in the context of deception, it's been used in 2 different ways. The first is to manipulate opinions using a false appearance of a consensus as an attractor. What do I mean by that? So let's suppose that my opinion is this circle over here, and looking at my feed, I think that the consensus is where the dashed line is. If I could move that simply by changing the filter, my opinion would be dragged along with it because I will feel a psychological need to keep compensating. So you can basically drag any person you want to wherever you want. And this has been used in adversarial ML campaigns by bots, which exploit this by creating an actual false consensus, which the filter algorithm then learns and follows, because these filter algorithms try to do all forms of margin maximizations. The other thing that is really useful in terms of deception is to artificially create an us versus them dynamic. Because if you have this narrow view of what the opinion distribution is, and you're suddenly seeing an opinion somewhere where the them is, your thoughts would be, well, that's like 10 sigmas out. There's just absolutely no way that somebody from my tribe would say any of those things. Therefore, that cannot be part of my tribe. That's a them. And I need to protect us from them. And you get people polarized and combative and scared and all of the things that really, really help when you're trying to convince people, because nothing makes people more convincible than them being scared. Okay, moving on to the next topic. The information theoretic model from 1999 was supplemented in 2018 by a game theoretic layer, where they said it's not just dimensions of deception. You can actually have a compound attack where you first do this and then do that and all those, because you want to just move the victim through a particular path. Perhaps initially you want to create noise so that they'll be less certain of something, and then when they'll see your fake news, they'll be more prone to believe it, that sort of thing. So the victim is, in this particular model, a stateful victim. You can think about this as a Markov process. And what they were able to show is that even a very small population of deceivers is enough to overcome the entire wider population around them. And the reason why is because the social media graph is a very small world graph. It has a very low degree of separation. Everybody is a friend of a friend of a friend. So while you might think that your friends are people close to you that you know and trust, a friend of a friend of a friend, just transitively going through that a few times, already is everyone in the world, including all of those bots that are trying to attack, which is why they can do that extremely easily if only they can, just like with the target the influencers portion, just convince the victim to be a proxy for them. So all you need is for your first victim to become a megaphone for your attacks, to start saying the things that otherwise you would want to be saying, and they can convince other people. And again, you only need to touch thousands and they do all of the rest. They convince the millions. And this is not just a game theoretical analysis. This has been verified experimentally. Lies just spread better on Facebook in just about every metric that was measured. They are faster, they propagate deeper, they reach 100 times more people. It's just scary how much lies are better than truth in this, and it's not really surprising. I mean, if we talked before about how the Facebook feed is addictive, and that's sort of an analogy trying to portray Facebook as a drug pusher of some kind. Those who go down the path of deception, they're not just pushing drugs, they're pushing designer drugs. These lies are specifically tailored so that they would maximize their impact and maximize their propagatability. So it's really, really not surprising. They have a great advantage compared to truth, which is just truth. It is what it is. And you can see this if you look at any modern conspiracy theory. I mean, what you see here in the graph is a Google trend graph for flat eartherism. And there was just basically no flat eartherism until only a few years ago, and suddenly, whoops, it goes up and then it goes down and it looks extremely controlled. So I'm going to push my own conspiracy theory here. I think somebody's pulling the strings in all of these conspiracy theories because that's a social experiment. That's a social experiment that can tell you how easy it is to propagate this kind of thing. So lies don't always propagate, don't just always propagate better, they also stick better. And I mentioned this friend of a friend of a friend. That's one of the many, many cognitive biases that makes us trust lies when we hear them on Facebook. We think that they're from our friends just because our friends relate them. Even if our friends didn't relate them, we hear them from a blended news feed, blended sources, which means that we just misattribute them and think that our friends said them and therefore they can be trusted. And this is just one of a great many cognitive biases that we have and are simply hacked by these deceptions to make us believe that they are true. Okay, so very easy to deceive and excellent successes, also very cheap. The Russians were previously using over $100 million in order to buy American PR companies for them to lobby in Washington. And suddenly they realized that in only tens of thousands of dollars, they could do this massive influence over millions of voters. And obviously, once you have that kind of superpower, there are going to be copycats. And indeed, the number of countries that have been using computational propaganda has been on a very steep and very steady rise, 28 of them in 2017, all the way to 70 of them in 2019. If you look at a map of those countries that are engaged in this, those are the dark blue ones, they're basically covering the entire world. And as you can see, even Australia is part of this party and is, or at least has been, pushing falsehoods through online mechanisms. Specifically, Australia is not very good at it. And I only know of one example where it's verified that this is the case. I suspect a lot more, but the one verified example is Tony Abbott had fake Twitter followers that boosted his account. Okay, you might at this point be interested to hear, so what political biases does Facebook have? And we'll talk about the US context. This is the question that people keep asking me. And I really think that's the easy story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. So bias, what is bias? Well, if you look at the Facebook demographic, it's very skewed in just about every dimension you can think of. People on Facebook are skewed towards being young, female, highly educated, college degrees, and urban dwellers as 4 examples. So from the get-go, you have this skew. And politics correlates with everything, really everything. It even correlates with the weather. And it seriously does, by the way. And in the case of the 4 dimensions that I just now listed, all 4 of Facebook's demographical skews, all of them correlate with a liberal leaning. So Facebook's demographics is, to begin with, skewed liberally. What does that mean? Well, what that means is an advantage to a conservative player wanting to push a voter suppression campaign, which, as I said, is much easier to do than to boost turnout. So what that means is if you had, I don't know, had Trump and Biden both try to use exactly the same tricks, and let us suppose that the message that each of them has would have been equally conducive to the kind of campaigns that that Facebook is good at, which is not the case, by the way. It would still be the case that Trump would have an easier job because they would have a lot more people that they could influence with it. And the sharing practices are also skewed because you have conservatives and liberals sharing in different rates, different types of news, all of which makes it, to begin with, very, very a very skewed environment where you don't really have a good definition of what bias means. When I'm talking about biases, I like to think about what are the options that they had, that Facebook had, and what decisions they made. And I gave here the example where things really started to boil for Facebook, which was that in May 2016, an ex-employee accused Facebook of using human editors to decide what is trending, mainly to editorialize what is trending. And that introduces skews because they had liberal biases in their opinions. These are people from San Francisco, you would expect that. And also they were inconsistent in their decisions between person to person, and that is just as expected because, well, they're human. So Facebook saw the public backlash and immediately fired that entire staff and replaced them by algorithms. And in retrospect, they probably didn't have any other choice. For one, they initially lied about the trending feature, said that it was purely algorithmic, and that probably was the original sin here. And second, they are trying very, very hard to avoid regulation in the US. And they only do that by saying, we don't editorialize, we are not a news provider, we're just a platform. And of course they editorialize. Doesn't really matter if they do it by an algorithm or by a person, but in terms of the legislature, the fact that they were using people in order to do that raised some red flags and increase the chance that Facebook would be under regulations, which they couldn't afford. So they made this choice. And the problem is that every choice that you make has costs. And while having human editors could get you to some inconsistencies and some biases, not having them had other biases and other problems. Specifically, the IRA bots immediately pounced on this opportunity because the algorithms had much less understanding of what the context is and what is true versus what is not true, and you could bombard the network in order to make things artificially trending, and that's exactly what happened. Fake news immediately started trending. So all choices that you make are biased. And if you ask me, the real root of the problem isn't that the choices are biased, but the fact that Facebook ran experiments like the voter megaphone experiment in 2010 and every other experiment ever since. And they're still doing it, by the way. And when you run that kind of experiment and when you do your data science homework, what happens is that you know exactly where your choices are going to lead. That's the power of data science. And as a result, you can't just say that the choices are biased. The choices are intentionally biased. You made the choice knowing exactly which, in this case, political party was going to benefit from it. And that's the root of the problem. And that problem has no easy solution because you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. Every choice that you make is going to be biased. And when I said this, when I published this in 2016, people told me that this is a very theoretical, very philosophical sort of concern. But in 2014, Joel Kaplan was promoted to become VP Global Public Policy at Facebook, and he demonstrated to the world that this is not a philosophical or theoretical concern. It's extremely practical. He was brought specifically for the reason that Facebook wanted to build better ties with Republicans in DC, and he was doing his best to make Facebook more Republican friendly. And here are just three of the many, many, many things that he did in order to do that. So in 2016, there was a big public outcry about fake news after the 2016 elections. And Facebook said, we're going to crack down on fake news. And they built something called Project P, P for propaganda. And Kaplan killed it. And he did that saying, we can't have it because it will disproportionately harm conservatives if we remove all of that fake news. And he did that again and again, killing projects because they would disproportionately harm conservatives, or perceived to be. In 2017, when Facebook wanted to make it more about family and friends and less about advertisers, specifically reducing advertisers that pushed fake content. And in 2018, when they had a project called Common Ground that was intended to get people from different political views to converse in less hostile ways. Now, you might think, if you're a liberal, that Kaplan is saying that conservatives need fake news and inciting violence and all of those things, and he should have taken all of those off the platform. If you're a Republican, if you're a conservative, you are equally outraged by the opposite decision, saying, but doing it otherwise would have hurt free speech. And who is Facebook to start editorializing it? We haven't voted for Facebook. So either choice is perceived as a political choice, but for my money, the problem isn't with that, but for the fact that he had to make a choice. It was either do this or do that, and either one of them had a political impact that could have been easily foreseen. In the case of Kaplan, you can't fault him. He was brought in order to help the Republican friendliness, so that is very much in keeping with his job charter. But while I could delve into this at great length, I just want to recap this entire story in really two quotes. The first is from 2014, around the time that Kaplan got his job. This is Sheryl Sandberg, #2 at Facebook. And she was responding to people like Clay Johnson after the emotion experiment. And she said, Facebook would never try to control elections. Rolling forward 6 years to today, and in 2020, Alex Tamas, former ex-chief security officer at Facebook, says, I think Facebook is looking at their political advertising policies in explicitly partisan terms. The Republicans in the DC office see themselves as a bulwark against the liberals in California. So basically what he's describing here is a war inside Facebook. You've got the liberals pushing a liberal agenda, you've got the conservatives pushing a conservative agenda, and this has replaced democracy, because in the end, whoever wins inside Facebook has huge power in terms of influencing election results everywhere. Okay, that's an easy story. Everybody likes that story. Let's talk about the harder story, because I think this story, the easy story, doesn't really answer the tough questions. And here are some of my tough questions. If you think that Facebook's decisions are because of political expediency in the US, what about everything that happens outside of the US? Why are we seeing all of these things in Myanmar and Assam and South Sudan and Papua and Zimbabwe and in so many other places in the world? And it's always the same story. Facebook is being used by well-coordinated, well-funded bot campaigns in order to sow divisions inside a population, inject lies, incite violence, and ultimately cause genocide. And you might say, Michael, you can't go on and accuse Facebook of these things. You have to let them defend themselves. And the answer is, I'm not accusing them of these things. They are saying that that's what they did. Facebook had a committee that they set up, independent committee, in order to inspect what went on in Myanmar and Facebook's involvement in it. And that committee came back and said, yep, we did that. And that was in 2018. And when you read today the responses from Facebook leadership, it's appalling. In 2018, about Myanmar, Facebook executives say, "Okay, we dropped the ball on that one. We weren't looking. We didn't know that we had this power. We will do a lot better now. We will not let fake news dominate our net, and we won't let Facebook be used to sow divisions, and we won't let it polarize people and incite violence. Well, they said that in 2018. You be the judge. Okay, so that's about political expedience, because I don't see any reason why Mark Zuckerberg would want to support genocide in so many other places in the world, in so many places in the world. So why is this happening if it's not political expedience? The second story that is being proposed as an easy solution is it's inevitable. That's just the nature of people and the nature of social media. Well, it isn't. There's been a recent study showing that if you increase your time on Facebook, you become a lot more partisan polarized. Whereas if you increase your time on Reddit, you become even more moderate. If you increase your time on Twitter, surprisingly, no effect whatsoever. Furthermore, it matters what your leaning is, because if you're a conservative, you're going to be polarized by Facebook a whole lot more than if you're a liberal. So this is not inevitable. This is part of design choices in the making of Facebook. And in this particular study, they go and describe the various structural choices that make Facebook different to Reddit. But I want to go a bit deeper than just those surface structural choices. I want to go back to why they are there, why they look like they do. So who and what does Facebook optimize for is the question. And it's not really difficult to tell, because you can look at their past history of what made them change policies and what didn't make them change policies. Here are things that didn't make them change policies. When the Facebook staff staged a virtual walkout, nothing was changed. When 5 board members left, and that happened in the year between mid-2019 and mid-2020, 5 board members left and policies didn't change because of this. So it's clearly not Facebook's staff that Facebook is optimized for. Okay, here are things that made Facebook say, we'll do better, and occasionally make a point change. Bad PR and a public backlash. They basically waited them out and went on with their life. A recent example is there was a public backlash about the amount of negative posts about Greta Thunberg. And Facebook course corrected by saying we will not allow bad posts about Greta Thunberg, but didn't extend that policy to anybody else, any group. It's just Thunberg herself. Okay, so it's definitely not the public. It's definitely not the users that Facebook is optimized for. And that probably is the core difference between that and Reddit, say. But here are the things that did change Facebook policies. When politicians suspended advertising revenue, when they threatened regulations, and in mid-2020, this is the thing that caused Facebook to finally begin to fact-check politicians. When Unilever boycotted them. And after that, many other companies pulled their advertising from Facebook. They had an 88% drop in share price. This was long after Twitter was fact-checking. And by the way, to begin with, Google and Twitter never allowed hyper-targeting by political campaigns. So Facebook was, to begin with, with higher exposure there. So this is who Facebook optimizes for, the shareholders. And they see the direct link between ad revenue and share. So really, it's becoming marketer friendly. And the North Star to maximize ad revenue, well, you want to maximize number of relevant users, time spent on Facebook by users, engagement of users with Facebook material, predictability of users' responses, and ease of swaying users. These are your North Stars. And Facebook is an extremely data-oriented organization. They've been extremely data-driven. And all of their choices throughout history have been targeted there to maximize these 5. And they've been doing extremely well in those things. The problem is that you maximize them by creating a hyperpolarized environment. Zuckerberg himself recently noted that people simply engaged more with this kind of material. People engage more with inflammatory material, and they spend more time when that is the case, and they get their friends to join the good fight. Obviously, when you're in a hyperpolarized environment, you're going to be a lot more predictable because your margin from other people is just much larger, and the ease of swaying voters is maximal because, like I said, nothing makes a user more amenable than being scared. I think Randall Munroe said it best. This is important. Someone is wrong on the internet. So we like to like, but we really love to hate. We really love to fight all of the people who are against us. And if I was to recap this whole thing in one slide, and I call this slide an unnecessary inflammatory slide pushing disputed content that will make this talk go viral, the whole story can be summarized as follows. Facebook has programmed an AI to maximize its revenue by large-scale social engineering. The AI discovered that profits are maximal when the world is in flames, and the rest is history. Because when you have a machine that gobbles up $50 billion in a year, you really don't want to tinker with it. And the reason why they would even more not want to tinker with it is because what built this machine is their strict adherence to being data-driven. So saying now, don't be as data-driven because it's not really great for society at large, just isn't in their DNA. And look, it's technology. You can't put it back in the bottle. But in other cases, with other technologies, we have, in the end had regulation. And this goes back all the way to the Industrial Revolution. It's always the case that companies have different incentives than people in society, and regulation is what makes this thing work. But in this particular case, users can't push for regulation because they're completely addicted. Facebook won't, because of course that's the whole thing. And politicians, this is where it gets interesting, because where we see really good regulation is where lobby groups are weak. Where we see substandard regulation is where there are very strong lobby groups. In this particular case, there aren't any lobby groups. The politicians themselves are the lobby groups. They are the beneficiaries from Facebook being structured the way that it is. And so far, they've been playing this game and have not shown any interest in regulating any of it. And just to give you an idea of how little power we have to regulate Facebook or to enact change in Facebook. Remember the Google Trends graph with a nice up curve and a nice down curve of flat eartherism? Well, this particular Google Trend graph, showing a single spike, is for the appearance of delete Facebook as a hashtag. And that became popular after the emotion experiment. There was a sudden spike, delete Facebook, immediately gone, immediately forgotten. And on that happy note, that's all I had for today. And floor is open for questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Michael. That was awesome. So, as usual, very well researched talk. You hear Michael talk, he really does the research, and this talk was just another example of that. We're at 1:36, so we're over time, but we've got a few questions. So I'll jump in and say there'll be questions about. There's a lot of references in your slides. Will them? It's part of the videos now on YouTube. Will the slides be available? Is that a plan?
I'm happy to make them available.
Yeah. Okay, so what I'll say to everyone,
in fact, just give out the entire bibliography that I have in those slides. It's going to be partial. Obviously, my research went way beyond. I only put like 2 or 3 links in every slide. There's a whole lot more where that came from.
Okay, so what I'll say, if on the Meetup event page there's like a discussion section, if you want to put them wherever online somewhere, just let everyone know where this material is available. And I've already put the link to the YouTube video, which is still going on, in the Meetup chat. So we have a few questions. I mean, we'll carry on because people just drop out if they've got to go back to work. The lunch hour's finished, but I think we've got time. I've got about 5 minutes to answer a few questions. So can you see the questions, Michael?
I cannot see the questions. Let me just.
There's a little, but it's okay. I'll.
Yeah, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing.
Yeah.
If I can do that, maybe I'll be able to see the chat. Yeah, Q&A. I see it now.
Okay, so Martin's asked quite a few. So I guess the first one is, I think we've just covered that. Have you published this material in an academic paper anywhere?
I have not published an academic paper because I don't have any academic results of my own. This is just stuff from other people's academic results. I did publish in the Conversation one time in 2016 and one time just earlier this year.
Okay, and as we said earlier, Michael posts any links to all this stuff on the Meetup site. It's another question from Martin. Have you done any analysis of how effective suppression techniques are within a compulsory voting system like Australia? For example, influences voters towards spoilt votes.
I don't know that anybody's done that analysis. I don't think that spoilt votes in Australia are enough in order for that to be an effective measure. In the US, the suppression of votes is something that they've been doing since always. The US is structured so that the US election system is structured so that its election is on a weekday. You don't have a day off. It's quite costly for people to stand in line for hours in order to get to voting booths, which is why, in general, half the population doesn't do it. And this election had an outstanding 60% voter turnout, which is the highest that ever was. Now, that again in itself is skewed. I mentioned before weather. If it rains on an election day, that gives a huge boost to Republicans because the working class urbanites who vote liberal tend to just not go voting because it rains. They can't afford it.
Interesting. I didn't realize day of the week you have the election.
On a Tuesday.
Well, do they have sausage sizzles in America? That's the important thing. That's the only reason I go. So another question from Martin. No, sorry, from Ari Hunt. When most of the users are liberal inclined, then why is it easier for conservatives to influence suppressed voters? Shouldn't it be for liberals?
Oh no. It's easier to promote to suppress voting than to promote voting. So if you've got a population and you're trying to convince them not to vote, your job is a lot easier. So you have all of these liberals. It's highly skewed towards liberals, and they're ready to be influenced. Whereas if you were a liberal, you would be trying to do that with conservatives, and there'd be less of them to influence, or you would be trying to boost liberals, in which case your job is harder.
Awesome, thanks. So, Anonymous, how can we protect? Oh, shit. Sorry, that's my dog. How can we protect against this type of political influence? Do you want to take the questions, Michael?
Sure. So how can we protect against this type of political influence? Ban politics on social media outright or in a defined period before an election is the question. Look, I think that it's not difficult to get regulation here if you were inclined to do so. We've seen regulation against subliminal advertising, this is quite comparable to. We know that in marketing, we regulate the whens in the house. So for example, you're not going to get in your Saturday morning cartoons for suddenly advertisements for kid stuff. These are places that we were able to regulate, and we're able to regulate successfully. And it's not difficult to find real news on social media or elsewhere. If you look, and there have been studies about this, if you look at any of the mainstream news outlets, and when I say mainstream news outlets, I don't just mean CNN. Fox News is just as much of an example. They are by and large honest. They do not invent their news. This is not the same as what you're seeing from deceptive bot campaigns. So it's not difficult to separate, which is what I would have done, the blended feed in order to tell people this is news and all of the rest is not news. And then you can start regulating the news, because the news then becomes comparable with standard editorial processes, and you do have regulation on newspapers. I mean, if you look at what newspapers looked like before there were regulations, in times of Randolph Hearst, they were the worst kind of tabloids, and we just have regulation that protects population now. Not difficult to do. The problem is that nobody wants to do it. Politicians are right now reaping the benefits of hacking democracy. And I'm afraid that right now, democracy is in a very steep, very serious decline all over the world because of this.
Okay, thanks, Michael. I think what we'll do, we'll wrap it up there. We're getting a lot of comments in the chat that everyone really loved that talk, and I think it was pretty fantastic. So many thanks again, Michael. And will you promise me one thing? You'll come and do another presentation next year, because they're awesome.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and I always love to come.
And hopefully we can we'll see you in the flesh hopefully next year. So
hopefully.
With that, I'd like to say thank you again to Michael. Thanks for everyone for coming. This is our last event of the year. Have a great break, have a good rest, and we'll see you all again in 2021, hopefully. Thanks a lot, Michael, and thanks everyone. And don't forget to wash your hands and stay safe and wear a mask.